All right, good morning. Welcome to the first ever Cronkite Global Week at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. My name is Juan Mandel and I'm the director of Cronkite Global Initiatives, which fosters meaningful connections among Cronkite students, staff, faculty, and international media professionals, scholars, and citizens. Cronkite Global Initiatives fulfills its mission by building bridges of understanding, mutual respect, and shared global engagement experiences. It is my pleasure to introduce these accomplished journalists who will be discussing reimagining the US-Mexico border through the stories of women and the LGBTQ community. Fernanda Santos is Southwest Borderlands Initiative Professor of Practice, where she reports in 3 languages in Latin America and across the United States on pretty much every kind of subject out there, from politics to policy, criminal justice, natural and man-made disasters, immigration, public education, race relations, real estate, the US-Mexico border, and the economy. She got her start in journalism in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, her home country, where she bore witness to violence, inequality, and immeasurable hope. Previously, with the New York Times, Fernanda is a full-time professor teaching narrative writing and bilingual reporting at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And joining us today too is Alice Driver, who is a writer for National Geographic, the New York Review of Books, and Time. She is currently writing Absence is a Silent Pain, a book that examines labor rights in the meatpacking industry. She's author of More or Less Dead, Feminicide Haunting and the Ethics of Representation, and the translator of Abecedario de Juárez. Welcome everyone to the first event.
I'm so excited to be here. It's actually, I feel like Alice and I have been friends for a long time, but this is the first time that we meet in person. So if you ever criticize social media, remember there are good ways to use social media to make friends and connections. So thank you, Alice, for joining us. I have a little note here with my things that I wrote down so I don't lose track of myself. But I've been on this mindset lately that we have all these bios that say all these things about us, and I'm this, I'm that, I'm so amazing because I did all these things. But what is it about you that you feel that the bios leave out? Or when you say, like, who is Alice? Who is Alice Driver? What moves you? What are you about?
Well, I think so much of my love of writing and storytelling has to do with my own story and my parents' story. That I was born in the Ozark Mountains. My parents were part of the Back to the Land movement, which was a movement in the 70s rejecting consumerist culture. So my dad built our house, and my parents grow their own food, and I grew up without a TV, so that could be partially why I ended up reading so much, and since first memory I wanted to be a writer. So that's kind of a part of my story that often people say, "You're from Arkansas, why are you writing about Mexico?" It's and so my story began in Arkansas, but I fell in love with learning languages and also specifically with Mexico when I studied abroad there, and I always wanted to live in Mexico City. So when I got a scholarship from the UNAM, the National University in Mexico City, in 2012, that was just like, this is my dream. I'm staying.
Well, I'm glad that you talked about where you come from, and we're going to talk about it later. But I think that so much of where we come from informs, and how we were raised, right, informs our approach to journalism. But journalism is this kind of like really traditional, can be a very traditional field, right, where you have a very specific path. I mean, we are at a journalism school. People come and they study, they do undergraduate in journalism, or they might do graduate school in journalism, come from something different, or even do both, undergraduate and graduate. And then they do internships while they're in college and set themselves up optimally to get to a great job once they graduate. But that's not the road that you took. And I love unconventional roads to journalism, because I think that's one of these professions that also gets a lot when people kind of come from the outside in, so to speak. So tell us a little, how did you fall into this?
Well, I wanted to be a writer, and my mom is a weaver and my dad is a potter, so I had a very interesting upbringing. But once it came time for college, my parents said, you can do whatever you want. You don't even need to go to college, but you're paying for it. So I ended up going to Berea College, which it's one of 3 work schools in the United States. So you work for the school, in the cafeteria as a janitor or whatever, and in exchange you pay no tuition. So I was an English major and a Spanish major at Berea, and my entire writing career is really based on the fact that I graduated with no debt. And so I'm really thankful to Berea, because the risks that I have taken have been, everything is on the table. In terms of freelancing, sometimes I have $500 in my bank account. I don't know if I'm gonna make rent. I've slept on my brother's couch for a month. I have done it all, and I am happy with that decision. Like, I have lived so many amazing and interesting stories that I never even imagined. So I graduated from college. I was waitressing after college, like many English majors probably, and I was very unhappy. I'm like, how can I be a writer? I don't have any money. How do you make money writing, etc.? And so one of my professors said, apply to an MA PhD program, get funding, and then you have some money and you can write and do research. And so I was like, okay. I never ever considered journalism. I never considered any program that was gonna be very expensive. For example, Columbia journalism never crossed my mind, simply for the, related to my financial situation. So I actually got married young at 24, so I was staying near my husband at that time. And so I just applied to University of Kentucky for a Hispanic Studies program, which my area of expertise is contemporary Latin American literature, which I think is an incredible background for a journalist and a writer. I love it. I mean, so much of like the poetry and all of the kind of things that inspire me are really based in literature and in my cultural experience of Latin America, and of getting to know so many writers and filmmakers and poets. And all of that goes into the journalism that I'm doing. So I graduated with a PhD, and then I got a postdoc in Mexico City, which is how I wrote my first book. My first book was my graduate thesis. And after the postdoc, I said, I don't want to be an academic. I don't like academic writing. I like being in the street. I like interviewing people. I like photography, all these things. And so then I was just like, how do I figure out how to sell stories and freelance? And so then it's just like starting from zero. So I knew my book was about femicide and violence against women. So the first place I ever pitched is Women's Media Center, which was founded by Gloria Steinem, and it's based in New York. And this turned out to be very key for me, because my first editor there, Lauren Wolf, was extremely supportive of me and helpful. She said, look, I think you have a really good topic here, but your writing is still too academic, and you're gonna have to work on that. You're gonna have to work. And she took the time to do that. Not all editors have the time to do that. And I'm telling this story because Lauren was my first editor. This was in 2012, I think. Flash forward to 2017, I get invited by the Nobel Women's Initiative, which is run by Nobel laureates, to travel with 5 Nobel laureates to Honduras and Guatemala for 2 weeks. Who recommended me for that? Lauren Wolf, my editor from 2012. So I think you could, especially in freelancing or in journalism, you can really never underestimate the relationships that you have, and to choose wisely. You are choosing, you are not just looking to every editor and saying, oh, I need to make them happy. You are also evaluating, is this a person who I respect, who treats me well, And those are the relationships you want to maintain, because there are definitely some toxic dynamics in journalism, and you have to be willing to evaluate. I think when I went in, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to please every editor. And right now I'm like, oh, here's an editor who I think is unethical, therefore I'm just not, I'm not even gonna work with that person. So it's a two-way street. So anyway, my story is very, very non-traditional in that sense of how I came to journalism through academia.
Yeah, I'm so glad, I think it's a great opportunity for the audience to hear about the fact that you can come into journalism in a lot of different ways. And there's historically, in the minds of journalists, I think there is a separation between the academic, the researcher, and the journalist. It's like two different things, right? Here in the school, of course, we have both, as all higher learning institutions of higher learning have. But one of the reasons I love this, it's because it was organized by an academic, Juan Mundell, and here I am, a practitioner, doing it. So it's all very, very interconnected, and I am, I think we can only gain from it. I'm going to unlock my phone because I'm following my points here, and weirdly enough, you're speaking and giving me the perfect segues for what I wanted to talk about next, because I want to talk about labels, right? You're a white woman, clearly, Alice Driver, from Arkansas. I mean, it can't get, I'm sorry if it can't get any whiter than that, right? And in this country, I find, and I say in this country because I'm not from this country. I mean, I grew up in Brazil and I moved here as an adult. So I was very much formed, as you were, by the place where I'm from and the environment I grew up around. But I find that this country is so tied to labels, and they look at us and they say, oh, Alice Driver, white woman from Arkansas, and people already think they know everything about you. Just like they look at me, oh, Fernanda Santos, brown woman from Brazil, I know, I'm immigrant, I know everything about her already. I don't need her to tell me anything. But in addition to having a non-traditional path into journalism, also, not that you're the only one, but also as a white woman, you sort of created this niche for yourself, and have gone deep into the world of voices that are too often misrepresented, not so much underrepresented, but I think the main issue for me is more of misrepresentation. We represent them based on assumptions that are not reflective of the realities of those people. And so can you talk a little bit about this idea of being a white woman going into these spaces? What type of reaction do you get from people, and what have you learned along the way about yourself and also about the way others see you?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question, because I do get asked this, oh, you're from Arkansas, why are you covering Mexico and Latin America as a journalist? But I would say the roots of my work are really in language. My PhD was in Spanish. I did a year in Spain and part of that time in Mexico, and then a year at the National University in Mexico City. So my language skills are of a quality that, aside from native speakers, very few journalists have. And I use that I do subtitles. So I do, I've done work for films, podcasts. I do podcasts in Spanish or in English, and I like switching. Everything for me is language based, and language is respect. So I know some journalists drop into Ukraine, drop into Libya. I was never interested in that. I want to be working in the language of the region, and it is for me a deep form of respect. So if you show up, and it does not matter the community, I feel like a lot of the respect that I build with the communities I work with is based on that, because you're not just showing up as, a white woman. If you show up prepared and understanding linguistic and cultural backgrounds, I think that just takes, that's an entry, a whole nother level of respect from me to them, and that's what I'm interested in terms of the work that I'm doing. And, you know, and Fernanda speaks, you know, Spanish, Portuguese, English, maybe,
French.
and also French. And I think this is so important. It's something in Arkansas, I never got a good language education. Only when I got to college did I realize, oh, you know, I could learn other languages. And I was really terrified and upset that I hadn't done it earlier. So in terms of working with marginalized communities, that's the beginning. And it's also thinking about what kind of stories you want to tell. And I was always interested in voices that I hadn't heard. I mean, most of my stories would be like, where did that, you know, I did a story following two trans women from El Salvador through asylum. One gained asylum in the United States and the other gained asylum in Switzerland. And I went, you know, I followed one to the United States, and then I flew to Switzerland to check in with the other woman that I wrote about. And that entire story came about from my own curiosity reporting on the border and interviewing trans women, and they were all from El Salvador. And then I said to an editor, I think this is a story. So a lot of times my stories are coming from my curiosity and me presenting them to editors. So it's not often outlets telling me what they want, and that's just what I'm interested in, and also why I've never had a staff job. I really have always wanted to do my own projects, to fund them, also to hire. I mean, speaking of working with marginalized communities, when I get a budget, who am I hiring? What photographer am I working with? I'm hiring a woman, I'm hiring someone who's non-binary. I was last year I was on the board, I was in Reynosa, and I went with Veronica Cardenas, who is Mexican-American, non-binary. And we were in Reynosa, and I was interviewing a trans man who was traveling with his child. And Veronica said to him, would it make you more comfortable if I could get you a binder? And he was so emotional about it because no one had asked him that. And I wouldn't have thought to have asked about that. And so it's really important, if you, like, as a white woman, who am I hiring? What am I doing with the budgets that I have? And for me, that's a space of power. Even if, let's say, Time Magazine comes to me and says, this is what we're doing, and I don't get to choose a photographer, but I can say, women represent only 15% of photographers internationally, and you should hire, and I send them a link to Women Photograph or to Foto Femininas. So you have that influence over editors, and all this for me is related to covering these marginalized communities, the way that you go about doing it with, you know, the bits of power or influence that you have.
It's such a great way to think about this notion of diversity, right? That's usually so associated with the appearance of people, right? You're Black, you're Latino, you're Indigenous, your heritage, but it's mostly a visual, right? We can imagine that picture, the perfect Benetton. Am I dating myself when I talk about the United Colors of Benetton? Does anybody remember? Okay, okay. So, but it's so much more than that, right? And this idea of respect, I wholeheartedly agree. I also never had great aspirations of reporting from places where I didn't feel that I could use who I am and my knowledge to elevate and deepen the stories that I was covering. Because what bothers me most in the coverage of things that are familiar to me is how superficial they are. They seem very well informed for those who don't have the deeper understanding, but many who do read those stories and they're like, oh gosh, it's another reporter who parachuted somewhere and put the nice words together and are now pretending to be the authority on that. So Chris, can you put the first slide from my presentation up? I'm just gonna show, actually the next one. I'm just going to show some of the sort of like screenshots, some homepage visuals of some of the stories that of the many stories that Alice has written. So this one is, I'm sort of like taking us into this idea, deepening the idea of the voices that we don't hear, right? And putting the camera on the shoulders of the people who are our focus, as opposed to us filming them. We're seeing things through their eyes, right? And this is a story you did for Time Magazine on the migrant caravan, where you actually spent time with them. So not only were you in there, but you took us there, and you gave ownership of the story, so to speak, to the people who were part of that story. How do you go about, number one, selecting these perspectives? Sorry, it's a bad day for allergies here. So how do you go about selecting these perspectives? And how do you go about convincing editors that this is the perspective worth reporting around? Because a lot of editors feel like they already know how the story should be told. And you hinted at that a little bit. So you can use this as an example, but feel free, of course, to bring any others into the picture.
No, this is a great example, because for me, this was a historic moment covering the migrant caravan for Time Magazine, and they assigned me a very famous Magnum photographer, Jerome Sesame. He's right now in Ukraine he's doing a story for the New Yorker in Ukraine. So it was kind of a historic moment for me, and I had been traveling with the migrant caravan from Oaxaca for a freelance story when Time contacted me and said, we want you to cover, the caravan was in Mexico City for about a week. So Jerome and I when I work with a photographer, I usually work quite closely because I personally love photography. I mean, I even had a moment where I thought, should I go to photography school? Because I wasn't sure, I love writing, but anyway, so I went through that, and then I decided, no, I love photography, I love working with photographers, and I honor their images. My story hews to the images, and not all writers do that, and not all writers care about photographers. It's an interesting relationship, but I try to honor and center the work of the photographer. And so in this case, we were together from basically like 3 a.m. to midnight at the stadium where the migrants were housed in Mexico City. And then when they left to go to Tijuana, we traveled, they left on the metro, which was also, the Mexico City metro made the metro free for migrants. It was a really beautiful moment and gesture. And Time Magazine said to me, they said the assignment is to cover the migrant caravan. They didn't say what focus, what angle. And this is the case, a lot of the time people are very busy and they just want to see that you are professional, you have your own. I have a very definite interest. So when I came in, I started interviewing women. There was a station at the stadium step for free birth control. So that is, and a lot of times I'll ask a photographer if there's things that I think are interesting, I will ask him to take a photo. So in that, since it's very interactive, I'm like, oh, I just interviewed this trans woman, could you take a picture of her? Or there's this station set up for free birth control, and then I interviewed migrant women about that. Why is this an important story within the migrant caravan, birth control? Or why is it an important story, this group of trans women traveling together from El Salvador? And so even though Time Magazine didn't tell me, oh, this is a story about women, no, my focus is, that's always been my area of interest, and I think it's underreported, and I'm gonna take that space and run with it unless you tell me not to. And in this case, in a lot of cases, I think if you have a very strong vision, editors love that. You bring the complete work, and it's like a really nice moment. It doesn't always work out that way, but I had a great experience with the editor and working with this photographer, because he did, we had a back and forth about what kind of images and stories we were telling. And so for me, it was just, I was so happy to see how it came out, because you never know, given all of the factors, how if your vision is going to make it into the world.
Right, and I apologize because the most beautiful part of this picture is the woman who's washing her hair, and the slide cut it the way I laid it out. But so anyway, look up that story online and you can see the full picture when you have a moment. Chris, can you move on to the next slide? It's not a very visually appealing slide. There is a beautiful picture of Estrella in another story. For some reason I should have put that picture to even ask this question, but Estrella is one of the 2 trans women that Alice met from El Salvador that she met and followed, and she settled in the U.S., right? No, she settled in San Diego, right, right. So near here, not too far. We can drive and visit her. But Alice did a written story and also a podcast in English and one in Spanish, which is the case of this one that we have here on the screen. How do you toggle between, when you're thinking about a story to pitch or a project to get funding for, do you already think about this is going to be done in one language for, in this case, both of your languages, right? This is going to be done in Spanish for this outlet, or I can pitch to these few outlets here. This is going to be done in English, and this is the best way to do it in English. This is the best. Is that part of your thinking, or do things happen more organically, or both?
It's a bit of both, but one thing that I do, and this is another area of power, is I always make the request that magazines or newspapers publish in both languages. It doesn't mean that they will, but a recent example is the New York Review of Books, or the target language. If all the people I'm interviewing are Spanish speakers, why would it not be published in Spanish? And often they will honor that. Often for them it requires, sometimes they don't have that platform, or they don't have other languages, or they have to hire a translator or whatever. But it's important to make that ask, whatever language you're working in. Should it not be in the language of the people that you were covering and or interviewing? So not everybody does that, but in the case of this story, it was funded by Long Reads, and it was a written story, but when I think before it got published, Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting had reached out to me about doing a radio story for them, and they do amazing audio work. And I said, I'm about to go to El Salvador to do this piece on trans women. And so they said, well, just, when you're, just take I have a Tascam, you need a better recorder if you're doing radio. So I was just recording all my interviews while I was there, hoping that this would become a story. This was in 2017, but following 2 women through asylum, this story took almost 3 years of my life. Not to say that I wasn't working on it full time, but simply because asylum takes that long, especially 2 women in 2 different countries, one in Switzerland, one in the US. And getting together the funding for that. All these stories I'm basically funding myself, because anytime you have a big story, no outlet almost ever is going to pay for that big of a story. So you're writing grants, or you're doing, in this case, I was stacking. So I had Long Reads for the written, then I had Reveal for the radio podcast in English, and then I had Las Raras, which is based in Chile, for the podcast in Spanish. So from that budget, I'm flying to San Diego, and I went to Geneva, which was an amazing moment to see, a trans woman who was fleeing death threats, and now she's studying French in Geneva and starting her own human rights NGO. And so what I love about these kind of really long-term stories is that you often get such a, if I'd only done a 1-month story, it would have been, 2 trans women who've been, beaten up and hospitalized and threatened, and it would have ended there. And so following it out, it actually was, there was a lot of really hopeful, powerful storytelling that came out of that investment of time, and also in the languages. It's, you know, that's something that's important to me, so that's something that I pursue and ask for. And so then people get to know, okay, this is someone who's working in these languages, who's interested in doing this, and people reach out to me for that.
I want to, Chris, can you pass to the next slide, because I think it connects really well. I absolutely love, I was part of some of the conversations behind the scenes about some of the drama. We won't get into it, but when I saw it, when it came out and I read it, all I kept asking myself was, you know, why did you have to go through so many challenges to put out such a beautiful story? The challenges, I think the part of them worth talking about is surrounded by this idea of the mainstream, right? I've been thinking a lot about the mainstream lately. For those of you who are like journalists from other parts of the world, in the United States has many labels we have a label for everything here, and an acronym too for everything. One of them is the mainstream. You may have heard the idea of mainstream media, meaning sort of like what represents the core of society, right? And as every place changes and this country changes, I keep thinking, who defined the mainstream, and what is the mainstream, and why should the New York Times, for example, be considered a mainstream media organization and not, you know, Latino USA? I mean, just a random example out there. So one of the challenges, having worked for a mainstream news organization and still working for one as a contributing columnist for the Washington Post, one of the main challenges is exactly to tell them that the way the mainstream views the world is not necessarily the only way the world presents itself, right? So you got to come with different perspectives. And in this story, you really went deep into the lives of workers, immigrants who work in meat processing plants in your home state of Arkansas for Tyson Foods, which is the largest or one of the largest.
It's the largest in the U.S. and the second largest
in the world, right? So a huge, huge corporation, very mainstream too, and very powerful, as we could tell from a subsequent story that appeared in the New York Times praising the way that Tyson was handling COVID infections among its workers, right? And you came at it from a totally different perspective. You came at it showing actually what was happening in those plants and how these workers were putting themselves at risk every day, dying, nobody really caring, nobody even hearing about it. So it's sort of like a two-part question. And the first one is, how the heck did you stumble upon this story? Like, what made you see, okay, there's a big story here? And the second part, and you can choose to answer it however you want, what amount of courage, because I can't really think of another word, does it take to report on a story like that?
So this story, I started reporting this story actually around 2016, 17, because I am from Arkansas, so I grew up. Tyson is, you know, the power in the state. You know, Tyson put Clinton in the governorship and in the presidency. Tyson money nationally runs a lot of the show. I mean, in the pandemic, that was the case. So I'd wanted to do a Tyson story, and I couldn't get anyone to fund it. And also I wanted to do it because my parents live in rural Arkansas. They live in a town of 200, but around them, there is a community, for example, of 300 Karen refugees from Myanmar. Where do they work? Tyson. So I'm thinking, what are all these Karen who speak Karen, and no one in Arkansas speaks Karen, and what are they doing in rural Arkansas? Like, what does that look like for them? And this is such a key, language is such a key issue here, because Tyson is, I mean, refugees from Afghanistan, from Myanmar, even Spanish, which you think, okay, Spanish is not that hard of a language to learn, but in Arkansas, almost nobody speaks Spanish. So these communities are extremely isolated in the sense that, and Tyson kind of depends on that none of them are going to speak the truth, because they're afraid of, you know, a lot of them are undocumented or in very precarious situations, and B, because no one even, even to get a translator of Korean or even of Pashto, I would probably have to fly someone in if I wanted a live interpreter, because I haven't found anybody in the state to do that work for me. So this story, I was trying to do this story, I couldn't get funding. Pandemic arrives, and I knew, because I know Tyson, you're working on a line, let's say you're making chicken nuggets or cutting heads off chickens, whatever you're doing, you're very close together, hundreds and hundreds of immigrants working, so close together. So I knew with COVID, this is gonna be an absolute disaster. Also because meat packing in general is not, it's not regulated. It's an industry where, you can be maimed or killed, and, it pretty much lives, the profits of this industry are made off of the bodies of immigrant workers. So I applied for funding immediately when the pandemic arrived. National Geographic had a fund for projects, and I applied for funding to return to Arkansas and cover what was happening in meatpacking. And I truthfully underestimated what it means to cover one of the largest and most profitable companies in the world. I can't even describe the layers of complexity of what I went through, even to find people who would speak to me, because aside from the fact that a lot of these people are undocumented, they do not speak English. A lot of them are illiterate. So think about, not only is it the pandemic, this is before the vaccine, and because I'm working with people who, for example, are illiterate, I can't just text them or even call them often because they haven't paid their phone bills, or they don't even, it sounds ridiculous that I can't. So I basically have to show up at their houses. So, I'm masked, I'm doing everything outside because I want to make sure no one's getting COVID, even though I did get COVID, and almost everybody I interviewed had COVID as well. And they're worried about getting fired because when you sign up to work at Tyson, they make you sign an agreement saying you will not speak to the media. Any problem you have, you'll keep it internal. So, and Arkansas is a state that has very strong ag laws, so I cannot go on Tyson property, I cannot take photos, I cannot take videos. Workers the same, because the company can sue you if you do such a thing. It doesn't matter if it's in the interest of truth or uncovering human rights abuses or labor abuses, does not matter. So it's a very strange environment to work in, where almost everything that I need to do is, it's like, how do I get around this? And that funding from National Geographic was key. And what did I do with my National Geographic budget? It was maximum $8,000. Always ask for the maximum first. And I think I say this especially to women, because there was another photographer actually from Mexico City who was saying, she was applying for it, and she said, I think I can do my story for $1,200. And I said, look, you need to ask for the maximum amount of money. You need to be realistic about paying yourself, about paying the people that you're hiring, because this is money that National Geographic has available. It's not like if you ask for less, what would be the outcome of that is that you're working in more precarious conditions yourself, and you're not providing a realistic, accurate budget that includes a living wage for yourself and for the other people that you're working with, and that does justice to no one. So with that money in my budget, I put in a budget for $2,000 for a photographer, because I knew, and I put down her name. I mean, in Arkansas, there aren't that many photographers doing the kind of work that I was interested in. And so immediately I have funding for a team for myself, starting with a photographer, but then moving on to translation and other issues. And I got funding from the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and then the Pulitzer Center, because this really, as soon as this piece came out, which was absolutely, I never thought it was going to get published, because I got harassed by Tyson. Workers were, dying of COVID, afraid of getting fired. I was worried about somehow exposing their identity, because all of the workers who are still there have to be anonymous. So this is another story. It's a conversation I had to have with editors. Like, any worker who's still at Tyson has to be anonymous. No photos of their face, no names. And so it's a very hard story to tell. And anyway, it took this piece, it was about 1.5 years of work. That's maybe 3,000 words. But the week that this came out, I had my first request for a book. And in January, I sold this book at an auction. 5 publishing houses bid, and so I'll be working on it, and I'm funded for the next 3 years, which is, I've never been in this situation in my life. So for me, this is a huge and important lesson, because this is my story from beginning to end, from where I was born to what I'm interested in, to my focus on women in the LGBTQ community, to the border. I mean, this is a border story in rural Arkansas.
In this next slide, I thought I should have a fun visual of the map of Arkansas. I actually just crossed into Arkansas because I was in Memphis. So I crossed the bridge, the I-40 bridge, and it says in the middle of the bridge, "Welcome to Arkansas." And then we went into West Memphis, went to Dunkin' Donuts, turned around, and went back to Memphis, to Tennessee. So that's the extent of my experience in Arkansas, although I do want to go to, at one point, to your parents' house, or to the Ozark Mountains with you somewhere. But can you give us like a location, a general location? We have, where are you near the Mountain View, I assume, right?
So I'm based in Little Rock,
Okay.
but Tyson plants are all around the state in very small towns. So the largest Tyson plant in Arkansas is in a town of maybe 2,300. So it's
So
this.
they have a lot of influence over the place. Yeah. So I brought up this map because, and like I said, it's almost like we rehearsed this, because you said the border is everywhere. And I think that that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have when they say, even when they hear my title, Borderlands, oh, so you cover so you teach about the border. I said, the border is right here outside of this school. There's a border on Jefferson that separates North Phoenix from South Phoenix, very different world on the other side. There's a border on Central Avenue that separates the west side of Phoenix and the east side of Phoenix, very different Phoenix on the other side. We fail to see the borders that are all over this country, really everywhere, all over this world, really everywhere. But I assume that the Alice that is now back in Arkansas writing this book and another book, which you can tell us what it's about, is a very different Alice than the one who left Arkansas many years ago. So first of all, you're doing 2 books at once in your hometown. How are your days like? Like, take us through a typical day in your life. And what is the other book, first of all?
Okay, so the other book is very different because both of these books came out of the pandemic. The other book is that when I got COVID, which was before the vaccine, and I was about a month in bed. I had extreme fatigue, and I was living in where my parents live in rural Arkansas. I had rented a house near them because I was afraid I would get COVID, and I didn't want to risk infecting them. And I did get COVID, so it was in that instance it was good planning. But when I had COVID, my mom left 60 years of letters. She was friends with writer and illustrator Maurice Sendak, who's the author of Where the Wild Things Are. She met him when she was 7 and he was 28, and they wrote letters until he died in 2012. And I knew him. This is not something that I ever thought, oh, this is a book I'm going to write. But those 60 years of letters, they're also illustrated. And if you've seen Where the Wild Things Are, you know his drawings are a delight and a treasure. And so my agent, I was talking to my agent about the letters, and she said, this is a book. And so she's like, put together a proposal, because it's an original source about a globally beloved figure who's dead, there hasn't been that much written about him since his death. So that book actually hasn't been announced yet officially, but so I'm splitting my days between doing a lot of archival research for Maurice Sendak. I flew to New York, I flew to Charleston, looking for letters. And I mean, he wrote, he was involved with, many cultural figures. So I interviewed Laura Siegel, who's a writer at The New Yorker, who was good friends with him. She's 93. It was such a delightful interview. It was a wonderful moment. And I'm doing some interviews on Zoom. And then I'm flying to New York because the New York City Public Library has archives, a lot of archives related to Sendak because he is from New York City. And then, for example, in 2 days, I'm flying to Miami with a plane full of poultry workers from Arkansas who are going to join agricultural workers at a big protest in Miami. The protest is to end modern slavery because in agricultural work, as in meatpacking work, recruiting often involves human trafficking. Mm-hmm. It might sound strange, but Tyson has actually been indicted for human trafficking because they're desperate for workers, but of course they don't want to pay them or follow any rules. So anyways, so it's a mix of me sitting at home going through either interviews in Spanish in the case of poultry workers, or now that the pandemic has lessened, I'm traveling more and doing more sort of active on the ground reporting and things like that.
Yeah, I am all for the multitasking. So I have the envy of the like two things seem like, oh my gosh, she only has two things. Not that it's only right for two books, but two books is a big deal. I wrote once and I was never under so much pressure than when I was writing that book, because there's so much writing on a book, right? And more than anything, I think our own egos, right? Our own, like, we have to deal with our own questionings of our abilities and so forth. But anyway, I wanted to open up for questions. Chris, if you want to pull up just the next slide, I listed, oh no, that's the announcement for Alice's book deal. Should have been there before. The Life and Death of the American Worker. I love this title. But the one before, Chris, if you can get to it. Sorry, the last one from the, there's one right after that, no? Oh, no, then the one before that? Oh, I thought I had one that said like questions and, oh, that's it, yeah. I just listed Alice's Twitter account, her Instagram account, and also her Excellence Substack, which, as you all know, Substack is a free publication, optional to pay. So you can receive her free newsletter, read about her work, get inside her head a little bit. They're all, I recommend following the three. But I wanted to open up for questions, and maybe Chris, as we're having questions, maybe you can put the other slideshow with the Alice brought with her pictures, right? Because you take pictures too.
If there's not a budget for a photographer, which in the freelance world, only about a handful of publications have a budget for photography. National Geographic, Time, it's pretty slim pickings. So if there's no budget, I'll do the photos. And I love photography, but because I didn't study it, I'm not the world's, I would prefer to work with a professional if I can get the budget.
Yeah, for sure, me too, because my pictures compared to yours are nothing. I'm a horrible photographer. Even my 12-year-old says that, so, Anyway, do we have questions for Alice? Yes. Oh, sorry. We have, I forgot to say, please speak behind the microphone. We have some people watching virtually, and also this way everybody can hear you.
Sorry, I won't repeat what I said in Spanish. I just said
But
thank
we
you very
heard
much
you,
for,
and your
yes, and
Spanish is very
obrigada.
Ginada.
Thank you, Alice. Everything you said really resonated with me. I'm actually from Southeast Missouri, so right across that border. And I studied Spanish at the University of Guadalajara in Mexico, and I travel there quite a bit. So, and I'm a former journalist as well in English and Spanish. I was really curious about the business side of this, because you mentioned quite a bit about the funding and everything. And so, you know, for those of us who aren't used to kind of, you know, working on that hustle and like getting the funding for, you know, freelance stories and that type of work, what kind of advice could you give to do that if you're just starting out to find kind of funding from various places? And does that ever scare you when you think about where you're getting your next funding from? Thank you.
I mean, this is an important question, and part of it is, for me, I always wanted to freelance because I was very clear about wanting to do my own stories from beginning to end, and to do long form, and I always wanted to write more books. So I have very specific interests. So I think freelancing is a choice. You might want to be in a newsroom. You might want to have health insurance. You might want to have a steady paycheck, and all of those things are great. And, you know, it really depends on your interests and your needs and et cetera. So freelancing is precarious, absolutely. And you need, in my case, because I'm fluent in Spanish, my side hustle is translation. And so that can be quite good money. And it's important to have a side hustle because you're never gonna make rent on writing. Writing is simply not, I mean, the standard good rate today is the same standard good rate of 20 years ago, which is $1 a word, and it's not even good. It's not, you know, it's not gonna pay your bills. So absolutely, I'm transparent. I've done a million, you know, I do subtitles. I was talking to this friend from Mexico City yesterday, well, a new friend, Cristina Rivera Garza, who's an amazing writer, and we were talking about Gita Schiffer, who's a Mexican filmmaker, and I remembered that probably a decade ago I did subtitles for a film for her. So I've done all these cultural, you know, I translated a book from Spanish into English, and I love these. For me, they all fit together. It doesn't feel, some people do, you know, content marketing or in selling stuff on Instagram or what. I mean, everybody has their model, but for me, I've always been very clear about the kind of cultural and intellectual interests that I have and the things that I want to do. And so freelancing does that, but you know, I don't own a house. I don't have kids. Nothing about my life is traditional, and I've accepted that as worth it for me to be able to, you know, travel with the migrant caravan or travel with 5 Nobel laureates, and all these kinds of really incredible and meaningful storytelling experiences. But the business side of freelancing is you have to be incredibly thick-skinned. You have to negotiate. The level of negotiation is unreal. And it helps now that I have an agent, but it's extremely, especially as a woman in this industry. I mean, I've seen, and I'm sure Fernanda has seen, I have seen instances of, you know, where I'll ask men, you know, what did you get paid for this? What was your budget for this? They don't always share, but sometimes when they do, you realize that you have done work for the same publication, the same thing, and you got paid. They got their flight, they got to hire a translator. I already speak Spanish, so I didn't get that budget, and I also got paid less. So all of these things, I've just become wiser and tougher, and in negotiation, especially now that I have an agent, I will absolutely leave nothing. You know, I'm like, this is what I need to do this work, because, you know, I have to pay my own health insurance. I have to pay my rent. I have, you know, I have to keep everything going. So it's a very complex puzzle, and business is a key side of it that I ignored when I started freelancing.
Yeah, I've never really done, I do freelancing, but I do have a full-time job, although I'm a single mother with a mortgage. So, you know, you kind of have to all the things that you talked about, it's very true. You have to weigh all of that. But I completely agree with you on having to be tough on negotiating. I think for women it's generally hard. For women of color it's particularly difficult, and the system does take advantage of you if you don't push back. And sometimes you will push back and they'll say, okay, because behind you there are unfortunately others who are willing to do the work for less because for different reasons they can. And that's all obviously detrimental to the entire system because it perpetuates it. But anyway, yeah, business side, learn from her, not so much from me. Yes.
I have like a general reporting question and a small second
Can you
question.
tell us your name?
Roxanne, my name is Roxanne de la Rosa. And
Are you a student here?
yes.
I'm
a student
sorry.
at Cronkite.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank you for asking. I just wanted to know, how were you able to get these the people, your subjects, to open up to you and get over the hurdle of like, you're just not a reporter chasing a story, that you really care about the truth of their story?
The kind of reporting that I always wanted to do was immersive and long-term. And obviously when you're starting out, you might get hired to write listicles or, top 10 Mexican Netflix stories or something. But once you get more into a place of funding and power, I do immersive long-term stories. So my commitment, for example, with the poultry workers, I saw them go through COVID. They also saw me go through COVID. I went to, I visited the grave sites of the workers who had died. There's so many, a lot of these stories are very emotional, especially over the long term. So, and that's just the kind of reporting that I'm interested in. And so for me, part of proving my commitment is showing up, is being there, is over the long term. Especially when I was doing the stories on the 2 trans women, I didn't know if they were gonna come out of that experience alive. And also when they were migrating, there were moments when they had no money. They would, we would talk on Facebook or WhatsApp, and sometimes they would ask me for money, or things that I say, oh, I can't give you money, but I can try and connect you with this NGO, or things like, all these issues that you face when you're working with marginalized populations over the long term. And I would think, I don't know if they're gonna keep talking to me. And there would be periods where they would disappear from Facebook, or they would even change their name and reappear on Facebook as a different name, because often, especially with trans women who face so much violence, they're often, dealing with issues of being harassed and stuff. So they would even disappear and reappear on Facebook and then refriend me. And I was always like, is this related to me? Anyway, all these stories are extremely complicated, and so for me, it's like, stay the course, be someone who's there, who shows up, who is looking for the truth. And I'm always aware, I want to talk to people who want to share their stories. So if there's ever a moment where a person says, I don't want to share my story, I don't want to be a part of this, I'm not ever trying to convince anyone. I want to work with people who feel that their story is going to change something. And so I think that's important, because I've seen people who want, it's like, if you have a fixed idea of a story, you're like, I need this, this, and this, and if I don't get it, there's no story. I don't see stories that way at all. Let's say someone I'm working with dies, or they decide they don't want to work with me. That is a part of the story, and you incorporate it and you figure out, what does this say about the story that I'm telling? Like, if a trans woman decides, I can't speak to you because I'm fearing for my life, that's a part of the story, because that's a part of what trans women are facing when they migrate. So I think, that's kind of my perspective, but that's from long-term work, not for, like a day assignment for something.
But if I can add something just real quick, I think what you said about showing up is really important, whether it's a long-term, several year, several month kind of story, or even a short-term, maybe you got to visit just being there in person. I think one of the greatest challenges these days, I speak from someone who teaches students to write longer stories, stay with the story longer, is to convince people to actually get out of the house and meet someone face to face. Spend time with that person, not asking questions, not right, but just in their world and observe them. I think that you learn a lot from it, and the person sees, okay, this is someone who actually made the effort to come here step into my world and spend time in it, even if for an hour, for 2 hours. It makes a huge difference. And if you put yourself in that mindset with your quick turnaround stories, you will just operate with that mindset, and then you can take it to longer term stories. It will be easier for you because it's already part of your practice, so to speak.
Just really quick question. Are you vegan or vegetarian because of your work?
So I became a vegetarian while working on this meatpacking story. And I've often thought of becoming a vegetarian. My parents grow their own food, and then they get meat from our neighbors, and so I've always grown up kind of trying to be deliberate about my choices. But yeah, definitely now that I'm doing this 100% Tyson story, it feels better while I'm reading all of this kind of horrifying information about meatpacking, because Tyson sets the standard in the industry. I mean, any corporate meat you're eating is Tyson or Tyson adjacent.
Hi, my name is Milana. I am Chechen journalist from Russia, and I am Hubert Humphrey Fellow. And be ready for a long question. I don't know if you read this book called American Dirt.
I purposely chose not to read it.
I read it because everybody was purposely choosing not to read it.
Yeah, that's what I did.
I read an excerpt that was, I don't know if it was where the excerpt was published. Maybe New York Times reviewed it, but I don't remember where there was a chapter that was published online.
There is in the beginning, if my fellows that don't know, there is the beginning of this story, of this book, was that it was very popular. It was like the excellent reviews everywhere, and the celebrities was like posting on Instagram and everything. Even the Oprah took the book for her book club and everything. And then there was a huge scandal that first of all, another Mexican-American writers blamed the author that she stole some ideas from another books. And I think another main question was if the author, the writer, can write the book if she's not from the area, if she is not from there, if she is not she's not working there during the long time. And my question is, did you ever face this kind of, like when your colleagues or your readers didn't trust you because you just came to the area and started to write about that area, I mean the border? And if you did, how long it took to deserve this trust, when nowadays people just know you as one of the best author writing about this topic?
So I love this question because American Dirt, for example, so I personally think anybody who puts in the time to do the research, or whatever that means, learn languages, go to archives, do interviews on the ground, anybody who puts in that kind of research can write about any topic. So the author of American Dirt didn't do any research, didn't spend time on the ground, didn't even bother to speak or learn Spanish. In the book, the book is full of not things that, first of all, things that Mexicans don't say. Second of all, they're not grammatically correct. Third of all, she does it just like a person who doesn't speak languages, like my abuela said, Hola. It's like, no, that's not how Mexicans use language, or, you know, it's just, so for me, it's not a matter of she was a white woman. That's, you know, that's one issue, but she also did no research, none. And so that's the problem for me on those kinds of issues. It's just, and if I think about the people that I respect in journalism, it's simply a matter, you can tell who has done the work, whether it be time on the ground or learning languages or making the kind of, some stories, you know, you see a story, you know, those contacts took years to make. I mean, you just know this is a story that very few people could ever tell. And so starting out, I think when I moved to Mexico in 2012, the strengths that I had was that I had a PhD, which is no small thing to go through a program like that in Spanish. And my focus was literature. So I had this incredible, I have this incredible cultural background in literature and film from Latin America, which I feel connects me with migrants. I mean, I have memories of reciting poetry with migrants when I was in Juárez, for example, or there's all these cultural and literary moments that make us feel connected or make you feel connected with someone. And so for me, that's been, I feel like it's a wealth of knowledge that I have that connects me culturally with Latin America as a whole in terms of my background in literature and film and poetry. And so living in Mexico City, then it was just sort of getting the on the ground experience and working on the border, which my first book was about the border. So after that book came out in 2015, I got a lot of work, you know, okay, you've established yourself as having spent a lot of time on this one part of the border. And so a lot of my work came out of that first book. But it's definitely, you know, my PhD was 5 years. My postdoc was 1 year. My book, I started in 2008 and published in 2015. So, you know, this is definitely time on the ground, time doing research, and working with all kinds of people in the field who are connected to these issues.
And I always have to add something, because when I was writing my book, I remember vividly firefighter. I wrote a book about wildfires. A wildland firefighter gave me a ride, and I think he offered the ride because he wanted to say that to me. He said, "What makes you think that as a woman who's not even a firefighter, what makes you think that you can write a book about firefighters if you're a woman and you're not even a firefighter?" And I said, "Have you ever written a book about the Civil War written by a Civil War soldier?" And I said, "No, but there are excellent books out there about the Civil War." That means research, spending time, dedicating yourself. So it's not about whether you're black, white, woman, man. It's about the commitment you have to this story. How much time do we, does this go into what time? 20 minutes, okay.
So hi, I'm Elira. I come from Albania. Actually, I'm a Humphrey Fellow as well. And thank you for this open discussion and your inspirational story. I want to go back to what you said about the borders. And I totally agree with you. Borders are there. We just fail to see them, or we just don't want to see them sometimes. Back in my country, Albania, the media is very central-centric, meaning that most of the cases we report what's happening in the capital. And within the capital, we mostly report what's happening with the political institutions. So it's just one boulevard and all the institutions, buildings are there. So it looks like the whole Albania, what is being reported is about what's happening. And the real Albania is left totally outside the conversation, totally out of the reporting. So in that regard, how do you convince editors that these border stories, these stories of underrepresented communities are worth being in the media? And these are really the stories we want to know about. And on the other side, do you see any impact on the audiences because of that? So how do audiences get engaged with you and the other authors when you report about these stories? Thank you.
in terms of freelancing, my experience is if you want to do a big story, come in with money. I mean, that has been the past several years of my life has been, I apply for a lot of grants. That is, I dedicate a lot of time to it because coming in, for example, National Geographic. So with National Geographic, I came in with $8,000. So I arrived to the New York Review of Books. I said I got an $8,000 grant from National Geographic. I hired the photographer. I paid the photographer. I reported the entire story. Here, like, I delivered this entire package. Are you interested? You know, they didn't have to pay for anything, essentially. And in my experience, if often with the stories that I want to do, if I want to do it, I have to come in with the money. So I have, you know, I've gotten very familiar with who has grants, you know, how can you write a successful grant application? They want budgets, they want letters of recommendation, you know, all of the format for grant writing, because no one was going to give me a big story. And I think this is a misconception in freelancing. All the time people write me and say, I want someone to fly me to Mexico for a story. I'm like, almost no I mean, it's very few and far between that publications are flying people around internationally if you're not on staff. It's just a very unrealistic expectation. Unless, I mean, the only time that I've had that happen is with National Geographic or Time, but I was already in Mexico, so they weren't flying me, you know, to another country. So yeah, you really have to go after what you want and make a case for it. If you're freelancing, you can't wait for someone to give you a big story. They're not gonna, especially in my case, I didn't go to Columbia. I didn't study journalism. I'm not from New York. I'm not from San Francisco. So my background is not, it does not lend to people being like, here, I'm gonna give you a gigantic budget to do whatever you want. That's not gonna happen. I'm gonna have to get that budget myself. And so I'm glad that I've reached the point where I've applied for enough grants that I feel like I'm like, okay, this is a story that I want to do. This is how much money I need, and I'm just going after it.
I will tell you something from the perspective of someone who's been a full-time writer all of my career. I was never a freelancer, so I don't know exactly what situation you're in Albania, but I always find that one smart way to do that is to find within your publication an editor who can be your advocate. You know, sell that story idea, first of all, come with specific story ideas, not like, oh, I feel like we don't cover Albania the way that it should cover. We're just covering, you know, the center of power here. We don't cover the rest of the country. Great, but what exactly are the stories that you would want to do that would justify going outside of this place that your publication or certain publications or all publications are so used to reporting from? And then once you have that defined, find an editor, or it can be both, can be done together. You can, if you have a good relationship with an editor, you can ask the editor to help frame those stories with you. But I think it's important to find someone who's going to be your advocate inside the newsroom, who can then bring that up to other editors and say, you know, I think this is a really good story and we should give it a try. And I think that once that one story is done and it's successfully done, then the next stories become easier, because now you have something to offer as evidence. Look, I did this and it was really good. We won an award, or most importantly, we got lots of people who read or connected with that story, watched that story, listened to that story. So if we did this with this one piece, imagine what we can do with other things. And then you're going to see that soon other writers or other journalists in this publication will start getting interested in doing those kind of stories too. So then it kind of starts spreading around. So, you know, that's a different perspective, because I've never had to procure funding ahead of doing my stories, but the biggest fight was, how do I find someone in the staff who will listen to my idea, who will talk through the idea with me, who will help me land on 2 or 3 great stories, and then help bring those stories to the attention of the people who have the power to say, okay, I want Fernanda to go to Caborca, Mexico, as I did, and write about the migrants who are coming and stopping there because they're afraid of Trump. And it was a story that I did that I was on the front page, but I had to convince, even though it seemed like a great story, there were so many questions the editors had, and nobody was really very aware of what Trump was going to do to this country. But because I was always in contact with people there and on the border, I was hearing things before people in New York were hearing. So, you know, bring those stories to them, very focused, specific, and present a plan. You know, I would like to spend 3 days in this place, a week in this place. A budget is a good idea. You know, I would need to go with a photographer. I would need to stay somewhere, but look, I already found an Airbnb that's inexpensive, or a journalist who's gonna let me crash with them for a little bit of time, so I only have to contribute some food, or, you know, some help with the utilities, whatever that might be. And then, you know, go from there. But I'm with you. It's like if you sit and go like, nobody wants to fly me to Mexico, to El Salvador. I always wanted to cover the gangs of El Salvador. Nobody, my editors never want to do, well, you know, find another way to ask. Complaining, I mean, I'm just not much of a complainer. So it's only going to take us so far, you know. Maybe that's why my daughter is the way she is. She's like, okay, I'll complain for 2 seconds and go, okay, here's my idea. Yeah. Anyway, Sarah.
Hey, Sarah Mensch again. I had a question that actually touches on the previous two questions. In thinking about American Dirt and how that ended up happening, like some of the words you were saying that obviously Spanish speakers don't use, and those kinds of things. I don't know if that got through an editor who just did not know about that or blatantly ignored it. But I certainly have had experiences in the past where I've had to do a lot of education with my editor or an editor in the past to say, you know, this is how this thing is culturally, or having to explain certain words and things like that. And so I just wanted to know if you both have had experiences like that, where it's really like you're having to do a lot of education, and if you really think that you know, that we need more editors who've had these kinds of experiences and the background to really understand the story even better that you're writing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a diversity issue, like with American Dirt, for example, or with certain headlines that I'll say, there was no woman or no person of color or no person from Mexico or no Spanish speaker on that team. Like with American Dirt, it was very clear, like nobody cared. It was just a kind of salacious story of stereotypes mashed together in a blender. Great, okay, it's gonna sell, fine. But with projects like that, I always think who was on that team, or even when I see certain headlines, often about, you know, let's say headline is 13-year-old girl had sex with, it's like minor was raped by X. I'm like, so what, that team was certainly lacking some diversity. And I feel like Fernanda can definitely speak to this issue, which journalism is still quite, even the New York Times on diversity, a lot of the major news organizations are not doing extremely well when it comes to diversity. And you know, I often think of Women Photograph, which has done an amazing job tracking women in photojournalism and what photos make it on the front page of newspapers. The fact that only 15% of photographers internationally are women, 15%, that means almost all the images that we're consuming in the news are shot by men. And when I see certain images, you know, of especially of violence against women and things like that, I think that is someone who was not thinking about, you know, all these issues about dignity and respect of victims and how should victims be portrayed. And so much of this is rooted in who gets hired, and that's why whenever I have money or a budget, I try to make my team the kind of team I would want to see in the world.
I think there's American Dirt, interestingly, was published by Flatiron Books, which also published my book. And so they took a chance on me, someone who knew nothing about wildland firefighting, and trusted my ability to research and learn about the topic and write a story that was true to the realities of the team of firefighters I wrote about, but the job in general. So it was kind of interesting to see that. But I think that there are two issues. I mean, obviously, the answer to the last part of your question, do we need more editors? Of course, we need more editors. We need. I think the main issue, the way that I look at diversity in general is that it has to be a practice. It can't be something you do when you come to work. You have to live, you have to change your mindset about the world. You have to stop thinking that because somebody does something or looks different, that they are better or worse than you. They're simply different. And explore those differences as a way of learning something about someone, and also teaching something about yourself. And even within the umbrellas of white woman, brown woman, immigrant, woman, journalist, there's so much diversity within that. But we have all been so conditioned to think of these labels as having one one main definition that rules the way we see everybody under that label. So I think that's one thing. People struggle to accept the fact that their opinion, the way they do things, the way they look, is one part of a whole, is not better or greater or bigger or worse, it's just different. And through the exploration of these differences, which is what Alice does so well in her stories, you can shed light into worlds that are generally ignored or misread or misrepresented, mostly because people come at it thinking, not consciously thinking, but like, I don't come from that world. Thank God I'm not a trans migrant coming from El Salvador here, but poor thing, I'm gonna report on that so that everybody feels so sorry for her and then can help her with some money, right? Like the moment you think poor thing, you're putting yourself in a position of superiority, and then you miss out on seeing the humanity in people. And it's not some Pollyanna thing. This is really true and real, and it's everybody needs to accept that. And I think the other issue with something like American Dirt, and there are other examples, many other examples, is this idea that we know better. People are so eager these days to be the first one, to put the first woman here, the first this, the first that they forget that are they putting the right person in that space? Again, it's not about Janine Cummings being of this nationality, ethnicity, or another. Was she the best person to write the book about? They said it was going to be like the grapes of wrath of our time. That's why I read it, because I was like, okay, I love John Steinbeck. I want to read the grapes of wrath of our time. As honest to God, there were moments that I kind of said, oh, come on now. And I'm not even Mexican, and I could tell this is not how people talk. So, going on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think that ultimately it comes from a good place, but also a place of poor things. We need to be the ones opening the doors for them. Pull that chair and let them sit here, which is why I say, I don't need a seat at your table. I got my own table. And there's an open seat here. You can come and sit and talk to me a little bit. I hope that I can have you can extend the same courtesy to me, and I can sit at your table. And one of the main reasons Alice and I connected virtually was because you've always been someone who was, at least from everything I see, who's been that way. I have my story that I want to tell. I have these stories that I want to do. You want to work with me? These are my terms, and we can find a place of agreement, but I'm not going to deviate too much from them, right? And I, on the other hand, spent a lot of years to get to the place where you've been for a long time, which is, look, I got my values, I got my skills, I got my knowledge, I got my expertise. If you think you know better than me about people that are me, or people I've lived with or reported on or learned about for years and years and years, and you're just rolling into it, maybe you're not the right person to work for. Maybe you're not the right publication for me. Maybe you're not the right institution for me. So I think that it just has to come from that space. You have to put your foot down and say, no, You know, that's not how it's done. It's a great way to end this. Fight the power. No, just kidding. I mean, a little bit. Thank you so much. I'm taking Alice for lunch, vegetarian, and I'm sure you can spend a few minutes here if people have a few questions, but thank you all for being so great, such a great audience. Thank Juan for allowing us to share in this space.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you to the audience and those who are online. And we hope that you will join us today at 4 p.m. for an exhibit that is already ongoing and a discussion with Photo Feminist founder Veronica Sanchez. Thank you both for being here. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me.